Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just get started with a few of these intro slides. Once again, if you will just take a minute to answer those two poll questions and put your name and contact information into the chat. Bailey, if you'll go to the next slide. As everybody joined on, you got that nice thing that we are recording. We are recording this session. If you don't wish to be recorded, just disconnect. Next slide. If you'll take a minute to rename your profile, you can do that a couple of ways in the dots or by the participant. Put your name and your contact information where you work at. Next slide. We are an interactive community, so please take a minute and turn your cameras on. We would love for you to be engaged in these conversations, to ask questions, and it's a great way to just be able to see everybody. We do, as everybody has, if you've joined a session in the past, we do have case narratives. They're a great way to solidify our information. If you have a case that you're interested in sharing, let us know. Next slide. As we're talking about anything today, remember that we are using people's information, so please protect their privacy, avoid any initials, last names, coworkers, just trying to de-identify all those situations. Next. The key components of the ECHO session is to just have that community of practice, share our knowledge of information with everybody. We do have a didactic presentation as well as our case presentation and any feedback that we have for the case. We'd love to hear in the comments one reflection you have from the session or one thing you might add to the practice. Next. Pre-registering for project scope, and you can do that via our email or on Zoom. To get that credit for attendance, we just ask you to fill out the evaluation after this session. And I'm going to ask you to go to the next slide, and I'm going to let Jared talk about CMUs. Or Michelle, I don't know who is on.
Oh, I can take that one. Yep. Stepping Michelle's toes. So yeah, thanks for that, Janelle. We'll go ahead and put in the chat the code for today. There is a CME code, and for that code that will expire tonight at midnight. Also, starting today, there is information on how to claim nursing contact specific hours for those who attend this session. So we'll put that in an email. That's a very new development, so I apologize for not having that information out sooner, but for those who need that for specific credentialing, there is nursing contact hours. Watch for an email with information on claiming CME or nurse contact hours. And once again, claim credit by midnight tonight, and watch your inbox for that information.
Okay, thanks, Jared. Okay, next slide, Bailey. We will put all of our information, the PowerPoints, as well as this recording onto our Canvas. If you have not received access to Canvas, you can email Project Scope or Kurt Phillips at usu.edu. RedCap is where we send out our surveys from. You typically get those 1 to 2 days after each session, so please check your junk or spam email folders for that. Next slide. Again, if you have a case presentation that you would love to share with us or hear information about recommendations, please take a minute and reach out to Project Scope and let us know that you would be interested in that. Next slide. We are on social media, so if you want to take a minute and follow us on Facebook or Instagram, those are our contact information. And I'm really excited today to have Samantha and Veronica from the Children's Center share with us about trauma and the ARC scope, the ARC framework. And I am going to just go ahead and let them take that over. So Bailey, you can stop sharing and they can go ahead and share, and we'll get going on that.
Thank you so much. Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks again for having us. We're excited to be here. Again, we're going to be presenting on trauma in the ARC framework. And today we're going to be doing an introduction kind of on trauma and what that looks like in childhood, and then on how you can use the ARC framework to treat trauma in childhood. So some of you might have extensive training in what trauma looks like in childhood, but I know for myself personally, it's always nice to have a refresher. So I know we have a limited amount of time and we'll try to get through it all as quickly as we can. So first, really quick on who developed ARC. So Kristen Kinneberg and Margaret Blaustein developed the ARC framework through their association of their work with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. So we already know, just knowing that there's going to be a lot of information in there that's related to trauma, a lot of information that's related to how to treat trauma. So it's really nice to know that they partnered with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. So we know that these two people recognize the importance of acknowledging and addressing the impact of trauma on development. If anyone is familiar with the DSM, they kind of recognize and understand that the DSM is kind of lacking in their ability to help explain the impact of trauma on development particularly. So what that might look like. And so what Christine and Margaret wanted to do was to make sure that anyone who was using the ARC framework understood the impact of trauma on development specifically during all different phases of development. So it works, the ARC framework is wonderful for children who are early childhood young, like 4 or 5, all the way up until adolescence. And so that's what's really wonderful is it works for a lot of different children in a lot of different settings. So adverse childhood experiences, many of you are familiar with what this concept is, but basically what it shows us is that there's lots of different forms of adverse experiences that children go through when throughout their development, starting when they're younger all the way through adolescence, that impact them in a lot of different ways throughout their life. Some of these things include emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, neglect, whether it's emotional neglect or physical neglect, and then also different household challenges. So maybe severe mental illness or difficulties related to a divorce, having a family member that's incarcerated, long-term separations from a significant caregiver, witnessing domestic violence, etc. And what the ACEs study shows us is that there are adverse impacts on the child's mental health and physical health, starting from conception all the way until early death. So this might be things like disrupted neurodevelopment, an impact on their social, emotional, and cognitive skills, and then adoption of high-risk behaviors that can then lead to issues with disease and severe mental illness later in life, and then an early death. So it's really important. I think we all know this. We're all here because we recognize it's really important to address trauma, starting from early childhood. So we want to talk a little bit about and hold on one second, my screen is being a little bit weird. Okay, we want to talk about some effects of exposure to drugs while children are in utero. So we know that there are short-term and long-term effects. Some of the short-term effects might be more physical in nature, like low birth weight and length. A lot of you are familiar at scope with the neonatal abstinence syndrome, which can include difficulties with sleep, co-regulating, calming down, and then also sometimes they have these high-pitched cries that they exhibit. Some of them have seizures, and then GI issues, and overactive reflexes. And some long-term effects might be psychomotor development issues, difficulties with self-regulation, cognitive delays and language delays, sensory concerns, and then specifically psychological and behavioral concerns. And we're going to go a little bit more into that. Okay. See if this works, Veronica.
Okay. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah,
okay.
It seems to be working. Okay.
Sorry, everyone. I've been having some technical difficulties. But the experience of trauma, including what happens during that prenatal period, often becomes associated with child behaviors that can be really challenging for us as adults to figure out. The behaviors that children who have experienced trauma demonstrate are often a manifestation of the rapid mobilization that's enacted in the face of danger to achieve a sense felt of safety. So having an understanding of where those behaviors are coming from is essential in better understanding how to respond effectively. You can go to the next slide. So to help better understand these behaviors, it's important to understand the biological component of behavioral responses and the potential functions of the behaviors that we see from children. So all of us are influenced by our experiences. Over time, our experiences affect how we see and understand everything around us, and our experiences shape our lens for understanding what's safe and what's dangerous. For infants who are exposed to in utero trauma, research suggests that there may be changes to both the mother and the fetus's hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis, which regulates our response to stress, resulting in the fetus having an increased exposure to those stress hormones, which can have some pretty major implications on many areas of development, health, and functioning. During the in utero period, there may also be exposure to substances, which we already know can have a wide range of neurodevelopmental effects. And that form of trauma has many implications for development as well, such as learning and behavior. In thinking about infants and young children, not only does that prenatal environment have an effect, but of course, what the child is exposed to postnatally can have major impact as well. For children exposed to substances prenatally, we can only imagine what that environment that they are reared in may encompass. So they might be reared in an environment where constant exposure to chaos or verbal and physical violence, unpredictability, or neglect may also be prevalent. But of course, the same may be true for children who are not exposed to those substances in utero. But in spite of the precursors, those types of experiences can create feelings of intense anxiety and hyperarousal for children. And that might lead to adaptations in the infant's typical bids to get their needs met, which can lead to peculiar behaviors in children. This is because child development and behavioral responses are dependent on that environment and the context in which the child is reared. So regardless of our age, we all engage in actions that are based on our individual experiences and how those experiences have been interpreted. When we have experiences that are related to danger, our brains form beliefs that influence how we behave when future danger is perceived, which is for the purpose of achieving that sense felt of safety or to enhance our own chances for survival. There are many strong emotions that are developed as a part of a traumatic experience, such as fear or rage, betrayal, shame, guilt, or submission. And those emotions are also involved in the behaviors that some of these children engage in. So the experience of those emotions and other environmental cues can begin to serve as reminders of the initial trauma, which also becomes known as a trigger. You can go to the next slide. Triggers are signals or clues about our world that have been learned as a result of previous experiences with danger. So the learning of a clue or a trigger is not only related to our explicit memory or our ability to recall information about facts or events, because before the age of 3, the explicit memory is not really well developed. However, we do have implicit memory, which relates to our memory outside of our awareness, and much of that is related to our sensory experiences. Infants and young children do demonstrate preverbal and implicit memory by reacting behaviorally when an event is repeated or when they're faced with stimuli that's been associated with a previous trauma. So in essence, it kind of becomes a conditioned response to unconscious imagery that's been stored in that child's brain. Once our brain has learned to read and react to these signals or clues, we may take action even in the absence of an actual danger. Triggers help us mobilize rapidly when danger is perceived to help keep us safe. The more frequently someone has experienced danger, the more rapidly those clues or triggers will lead to activation of a survival response. Trauma activates the part of our brain that's responsible for survival, as I said a little bit earlier. And that switch to survival mode is not within the child's conscious control, but those behaviors are being engaged in or enacted for the purpose of staying alive or staying safe and surviving that situation. Okay, next slide. So in ARC, the survival instinct is also known as the human danger response. And again, that's merely the perception of danger that activates that biological response. When children have experienced ongoing stress, including stress that may have been experienced in utero, the danger response can be activated indiscriminately. One reason for this is because of how our body defends us when we're faced with fear or stress, which relates to the activation of our stress response and the release of cortisol. The research has shown that children exposed to early trauma, such as maltreatment and neglect, have higher cortisol levels later in their development. And animal studies also provide indication that maternal stress in the early developmental period is also associated with a more reactive stress response system. So young children are more likely to be activated when no stress is present and to be more aroused when a mild stressor is present. They're also more likely to respond as if a severe stressor was present. Some studies suggest that prolonged exposure to high cortisol levels can lead to alterations in our HPA axis, which again modulates the release of our stress hormones. So the dysregulation of that biological stress system has implications for many symptoms that are often associated with PTSD, such as hypoarousal, anxiety, and avoidance, which if you really think about it, that's some of the challenging behaviors that we see in children with a stressful or traumatic exposure background. Those higher cortisol levels are also associated with regulatory problems, such as inattention, overactivity, some impulsive behaviors and aggression, or other behaviors that are associated with a lot of the neurodevelopmental disorders, such as ADHD, autism, or other language and communication impairments. And often, children who are suffering from trauma or stress reactions are mislabeled as having one of those diagnoses because of the behaviors. But the biological component of the response to stress is evident that for these children, there's a greater sensitivity to potential clues of danger, and the constant reactivation of that human danger response has potential impact for brain maturation and neurodevelopment in children. But when exposure to a trigger happens, the typical mechanisms for more efficient coping become overwhelmed because that child experiences surges of arousal, rapid changes in their physiology, and difficulties with clear thinking and reasoning, which can have major implications for behaviors that occur in environments that are generally known to be safe, such as in the classroom or the grocery store, where we might see these behaviors arise. And that's because triggers can be any number of references that don't necessarily make sense to us or to an onlooker. But the behaviors that we see are indicative of the body's response as if that trauma is happening all over again. And ARC refers to those behaviors as safety-seeking behaviors. So some of the behaviors that are manifested as a part of the human danger response are fight and flight behaviors, which a lot of us are really aware of. And then there's also freeze and submit behaviors that are defined. Okay, you can go on. So fight behaviors are those that are externally directed to attack or fight off a danger. In children, fight behaviors may manifest as verbal and physical aggression, irritability. They might be difficult to soothe or have difficult concentrating, or they might engage in behaviors that look like hyperactivity or just being overly silly. Okay. Flight behaviors are attempts to withdraw or escape from a situation. That might include behaviors such as clinginess, especially in toddlers, or behaviors like running away and isolating themselves from interactions with others. Okay. The freeze response is what I think about when I think of a little mouse who's become afraid. Sometimes mice will remain really still as if they're trying to be unseen. And in children, that freeze response is an extreme state of vigilance. There may be a lack of affect or a lack of emotional expression, refusal to move, or wariness of the environment, or being overly cautious. Okay. And then submit behaviors are those that are attempts to appease someone and accommodate a person to avoid potential harm. Children may become overly compliant or engage in behaviors to try to please others, particularly if that child perceives that person to be a threat. It takes a lot of energy for our body to be involved in fight, flight, freeze, and submit responses. And when a child has experienced a chronic danger response, there's a higher likelihood that the starting baseline of energy for that child will be really high, meaning that that child's body is essentially in a chronic state of readiness for danger. And when children invest that much energy toward being wary and surviving from situation to situation, the energy that's needed to support typical development is not readily available, which impacts multiple domains of child development, and we might start to see some delays. For infants who are unable to mobilize themselves to act on that fight or flight response, or who don't receive a response to their distress or their bid support from a sensitive caregiver, we may see adaptations behaviors typically used to get their needs met. Those adaptations may include behaviors such as increasing their bids or minimizing their communication bids, or symptoms of hyperarousal and affective shutting down or dissociation. That type of response may also present for a child who used that type of response during the trauma, and now the brain has learned to respond to arousal by dissociating to escape a potential threat. That can align with that freeze response that I explained before. Okay, next one. While the perception of danger is a stressor in of itself, and behaviors are enacted to achieve a sense of safety, many children also experience a lack of having their basic needs fulfilled as an additional stressor. Caregivers' ability to provide for their children can be impaired by multiple factors, right? And that's including things like substance abuse, which many of you may encounter. It can also be impaired by a parent's mental illness, by domestic violence, poverty, homelessness, and the list can go on and on of the factors that can impede their response. But when caregivers fail to be consistently responsive to their child's need, that child engages in those behavioral adaptations that I spoke about before. So we discussed how infants and toddlers may increase fussiness or their bids to communicate their needs, or they may quiet their bids in an attempt to adapt to their caregiver. Preschoolers or older children also adapt or develop other ways of getting their needs met, and ARC refers to those as need fulfillment strategies, which I have here on this slide. Those adaptive strategies or behaviors are enacted to have physical, emotional, and relationship needs met if the child feels deprived, rejected, or abandoned. Those behaviors can be very difficult to change, and they may persist even when a child is in a situation where their needs are being met. Those behaviors and the potential developmental consequences of traumatic experiences suggest the need for treatment that will address developmental competency, the meaning that children ascribe to their current experiences, and environmental safety. And the ARC framework recognizes that, and that children and families who have experienced trauma are served in multiple settings and by many different types of providers, including those like yourself. So the framework has been developed so that it has relevance across different systems and with different types of providers. And next, we're going to explain the different components of ARC that are addressed during treatment.
Okay, so as Veronica started to touch on, we're going to talk a little bit about first why use ARC, right? Because we want to make sure everyone understands why we use it at the Children's Center and why we think it's really beneficial for other clinicians to use as well. So sometimes there's a hesitation for clinicians to treat trauma, and there can be many reasons for that. One of the reasons might be because they haven't received a lot of training in how to identify trauma in young children or children across, their development lifespan. So it could be, I don't know when to treat it, right? Or how to identify that trauma is what's contributing to the child's difficulties. There's also hesitation because they haven't received training in how to use an evidence-based treatment or a treatment in general to treat trauma. There's sometimes, training programs or agencies who are trying to figure out what type of trauma treatment to use. And so lots of clinicians get a little bit nervous and anxious about that. And so what's really great about ARC is that it is an evidence-based treatment. There's lots of research that shows its effectiveness, and it's useful in the fact that it uses a lot of clinical applications. So within each chapter and each component it talks about, within each domain, which we'll get to talking about, it tells you how to use certain skills to teach parents these concepts. Clinically in the therapy room or in home or wherever you're doing it. It actually gives examples of how to do these things, homework for parents, things like that. So there's lots of actual clinical applications. And as many of you might know, there are evidence-based treatments out there that tell you what the evidence-based treatment is and what should be done, but sometimes is a little bit lacking in how to do those things, how to teach parents these concepts. And as Veronica had mentioned, it's an intervention that translates across service systems. So this can be used in multiple settings. It can be used in outpatient services, in home settings where you're doing in-home therapy, in schools, day treatment programs, and inpatient programs. It's very useful, and research has showed that it is useful across these service settings. It also allows for flexibility. So I think this is one of the most beautiful pieces of ARC, is that we know that when we see a family comes to us for help, that they're different in a lot of ways than the other families we work with. A lot of evidence-based treatments have a hard time being flexible and adjusting to each family's needs or each client's needs. And what ARC does is it actually allows for flexibility within its framework, whether that means moving back and forth between domains or allowing for multicultural considerations or language issues, things that often sometimes come up when we're doing clinical work and make it hard for us to use an evidence-based treatment that's only been tailored for one specific type of presentation. And ARC is different from a lot of evidence-based treatments in that sense. All right, maybe this is you, Veronica.
Okay. So the ARC framework is a component-based model, and ARC is an acronym, and it stands for, the acronym stands for the 3 core domains that comprise the intervention. These are attachment, regulation, and competency. So within each of these domains are core targets of intervention, which Sam and I are going to provide a brief overview of. But these core targets are each applied to reach the main goal of trauma experience integration, which is the child's ability to survive and tolerate their distress and arousal that's provoked by the perception of danger, and to enact the individual developmental capacity to engage in purposeful action in the present moment. Okay. So the graphic on this slide provides a little bit of a visual of the ARC framework. So along with the attachment, regulation, and competency domains are foundational strategies that are integrated throughout treatment. And those foundational strategies can be seen at the base of this graphic. And they include engagement, education, and routines and rhythms. And engagement just relates to how to keep children and their caregivers invested in the treatment process. Education is about explaining rationale and goals to increase that engagement. And then routines and rhythms is a foundational strategy that's used throughout the treatment process to stress the importance of predictability and structure and creating a sense of safety and modulation for children. Okay.
Okay, so the first domain that we're going to talk about, as you saw in that graphic, was the attachment domain. So the developers of ARC recognize that having a healthy attachment is really, really important and integral in a child's development. And so much so that and I think we know this from a lot of research too, is that a healthy attachment helps buffer against exposure to traumatic experiences. So it doesn't mean that every child will not experience symptoms related to PTSD or adverse or exposure to adverse experiences after having exposure to an adverse experience. Some of them might have more symptoms than others. Other children might not show symptoms at all. And having a healthy attachment figure actually helps to prevent that. And so attachment figures can include anyone from their biological parents to, if they're in foster care, a foster parent, or kinship care, an extended family member, teachers or caseworkers, anyone that is a big part of their life. And in the ARC framework, the developers wanted to recognize this because we do think it's important when we are doing ARC that we have that specific attachment figure involved in treatment. So the attachment domain has building blocks, and there's 2 targets. So one is fostering a healthy attachment, right? So a family might present with, saying that they're struggling in their relationship, or maybe some parents have an idea of how to identify the fact that maybe their child has an insecure attachment, or maybe they do themselves. But we can tell usually, whether it's through parent report or observations, that there might be some kind of distress happening within an attachment system. And then also teaching caregivers the skills that they need to support their child's development. And just as Veronica had mentioned, you're going to see those 3, building blocks at the bottom: engagement, education, and then teaching them also the skills that they need in order to engage in these different domains and work through these different targets. I'm sorry, my computer's being a little finicky. So one of the first things that they talk about in the attachment domain is caregiver affect management. I'll say that this is probably a skill at the Children's Center, and maybe all of you use as well, probably with every single family that I work with. And whether it's I'm doing ARC or something else, but it's absolutely essential according to the developers of ARC. So what you'll start with is provide psychoeducation on trauma, just like we did today, to the family so they can understand their child's symptoms and where they're stemming from, right? And then we talk about how it's normal to respond out of frustration, or the way that they are responding to the child's difficulties. We really want to normalize it for them. These symptoms and these difficulties, like Veronica talked about, can be really difficult for any type of caregiver who's involved in that child's life to cope with. Whether it's because the child is constantly dysregulated or they have completely shut down, it can be very difficult for the caregiver, and therefore elicits a lot of difficult responses out of them. And most caregivers will tell you they want to do less yelling or use less physical punishment or punishment in general. And most parents or caregivers will be able to acknowledge that they want to try to change the way that they're responding to their child. And if not, then we provide psychoeducation why it's important to do so. And then we teach parents some caregiver affect management skills. And this is where I explained how ARC does a beautiful job giving you some examples of how to teach parents these skills. Some parents don't have coping skills themselves or struggle to identify what those look like. And so we spend a lot of time doing that with caregivers. And then we talk about enhancing their support. One of the first things we learn when we're talking about working with families or adults or children in general is families need support, right? Whether it's from extended family members, neighbors, friends, or resources within their community. We want to try to find ways to support them so that they aren't having significant stress responses to their child's behaviors. The next concept we talk about within the attachment domain is attunement. This is so important, right? Veronica talked about how it's difficult sometimes for caregivers to understand why their child is engaging in these behaviors. So we teach them it's important to read their child's cues and then respond, just like we talk about in caregiver affect management, in an appropriate way. Lots of attunement errors occur, whether it's with children who have experienced trauma or children who haven't. Attunement errors occur all of the time in caregiving. So sometimes they might miss the child's cue. So maybe they're too busy, they're busy in the kitchen doing something else, and then their child, all of a sudden, they report their child started screaming out of nowhere, right? So they missed the cue that led to that behavioral response. or they're reacting to the behavior rather than responding to it. So, right, so you're yelling and you need to stop rather than I can tell you're upset. What happened that made you upset, right? So this is especially true in kids who've experienced trauma because children themselves often have a hard time recognizing, and especially if they're younger, verbalizing what caused them to respond that way, and that it was related to an adverse experience that they had. They can't really identify that it was a trigger. And so we want to teach parents to identify their child's cues of distress as it relates to triggers. What are their child's triggers? And some of the skills we talk about here, again, psychoeducation on trauma symptoms, right? They don't know how to tune into their child's cues as they relate to trauma if they don't know what trauma symptoms look like. And so some activities that I enjoy in this component of the attachment domain are being a feelings detective. Sometimes clinicians use the term feeling scientist, right? How is your child feeling? Let's tune into the emotional cue rather than the behavior. And then engage in reflective listening. What is your child trying to tell you with their behavior? Another important component of the attachment domain is consistent responding. A lot of us know that it's really difficult sometimes, caregivers, and if you're a caregiver yourself, it's easy sometimes to give in, when you're trying to get out the door, you just need to get to that appointment. The next time you're trying to follow through with, no, you can't have that. And you're wondering why, your kiddo, or parents are wondering why their kiddo isn't really believing them and following or allowing them to follow through with a limit that they set. So the ARC developers recognize that it's really important for kiddos to have clear expectations of what their behavior should be and what those rules are on their behaviors. And Veronica talked about the reason for that is kids need predictability, especially when they've experienced an adverse a trauma that they've been through, an adverse experience. They need to know that their environment is predictable. So when I do this, this is what happens, right? So we really want to make sure parents understand that why that's important and then how to follow through consistently with their responses. Sometimes caregivers can be too lenient. They'll feel bad about what their kiddo's been through and then don't follow through on the limits that they've set, or they can be too strict, right? This comes out of, wanting to keep their kiddos safe, and we absolutely understand that. And then caregivers, we want to always make sure that we recognize that they have their own history of trauma or difficult experiences that they have been through, or also have had maybe not the best models for how to engage in these type of behaviors from when they were little. And it's hard to engage in break habits and engage in new behaviors, especially when that's been modeled for us. So some of the skills that they talk about here are positive parenting strategies. We're all probably pretty familiar with these. Praise, using positive reinforcement, things like that. And then also being mindful of their own trauma and their child's trauma when they are responding, right? If they can acknowledge and be aware of why their child is responding like this, it'll help them provide more of a consistent response. Like I understand that I'm feeling guilty right now. I don't want to set a limit because I feel so bad that they've been through this negative thing. But I do recognize that they need me to be consistent about this.
All right. So that brings us to the regulation domain of the ARC framework, which relates to the ability to manage and regulate your experience. Our earliest experience with regulation comes from within the context of our attachment system as babies. And if that system fails to provide proper and consistent or responsive care, the resulting stress on the child's regulatory system can lead to significant emotional and behavioral dysregulation. So there's two core interventions within the regulation domain of ARC. And those are identification of emotions and internal states, which Sam started to highlight a little bit. And then there's also modulation. Okay. So there's developmental shifts in our regulation abilities. Babies learn to regulate their biological system first. So that includes their sleeping and eating, eliminating, being alert and sleeping, and even adjusting to like room temperature. So most of that regulation is supported through the external support that's provided from the simultaneous regulation of that baby's caregiver, or what can be considered as co-regulation. Adults do this by experimenting with babies to find out what provides soothing to them, which is called attunement, as Sam referred to in the attachment domain. Adults also develop daily routines and rhythms, which is one of those foundational strategies at the base of that art graphic that are woven throughout treatment. Routines and rituals are performed during tasks such as feeding, bathing, and sleeping, and that supports that baby's ability to learn how to regulate. A responsive caregiver may also reflect the baby's experience back with statements such as, "You're hungry, let me feed you," or "Look at how happy you are right now," or all the precious things that we say to little babies. And those distinctions begin to help that baby learn how to label their internal experience and discriminate between emotions and bodily states, and how they're responded to differently by a caring adult. Now, as that caregiver provides consistent and effective responses to the baby, the child begins to internalize those adult responses, and that increases their ability to use strategies independently as they continue to develop. Okay. But when children are exposed to early trauma and they may have not had that regulation support, they may not understand their feelings very well. So ARC treatment really aims to teach children how to identify their feelings as well as gain an understanding of the feelings of others. Of course, those discussions are held in a developmentally appropriate fashion based on the developmental level of the child. So with younger children, I generally aim at learning to label an emotion, just identifying emotions in themselves, helping them understand that emotions change, and beginning to recognize the clues that can help identify how that child feels or how others might feel. And there's an abundance of books or games and developmentally appropriate activities that we can use to support that component of treatment. Also within the identification intervention, there's a focus on helping children understand that some of their emotional reactions are based on experiences that they have had, and that triggers may remind them of those experiences. So for young children, there are many storybooks that I use to aid in that discussion of helping them understand what a trigger is and what their physiological responses are, and to help them think of their own individual situations. Okay. Not only might early trauma impact the understanding of emotions, but the lack of regulation support may also hinder understanding that co-regulation with an adult within a context of a safe relationship can also be a source of soothing and support. So because of that, children may resort to some pretty primitive strategies to manage their distress. And as children get older, they become more willing to do whatever it takes to feel better in a moment if they haven't gained skills when they were a little bit younger. And that can result in engaging in risky and unsafe behaviors in adolescence and adulthood. But those maladaptive behaviors, I want us to remember, are attempts to cope with their emotional reactions. So ARC treatment aims to help children and their caregivers understand how challenging behaviors have served as a form of coping, and to learn replacement behaviors that are just as effective, but that are also appropriate. Education is provided about the concept of body energy and how it differs, which is a great way of helping children learn about their internal experience. ARC places a specific focus on helping children and caregivers understand that our feelings and energy come in different sizes, and being able to identify that range. Along with the development of strategies that are modulating and soothing for the child, ARC also honors that the baseline comfort zone of energy for each of us is very different. So modulation activities and strategies are individualized to support a child at their comfort zone and to gradually increase or expand that range of comfort. There are a wide range of modulation activities that can address different levels of comfort. And those strategies may range from co-regulation with the caregiver, which we want children to be able to lean into. It may also include sensory approaches or gross motor movement, reading, music, arts, or all the different things that we can think of that help us cope with our emotions.
Okay, I recognize that we're running short on time, so I'm going to try to fly through the competency domain. So this is the last domain that ARC focuses on, and their hopes here is that this will help children increase their ability to develop healthy social skills, increase academic success, engage in community activities appropriately, and then last but not least, develop a positive sense of self. All right, so one of the first concepts that we talk about here in the competency domain is the idea of executive functioning. We provide lots of psychoeducation to parents on how trauma impacts the development of the executive functioning portion of the brain, that front part of your brain, and how because the alarm mode or limbic system is constantly activated, it affects the child's ability to develop that front part of their brain. And this teaches children to act rather than react, right? When we talk to them about and help them develop that front part of their brain. Providing psychoeducation on this can actually help the parent empathize a little bit more with the parent, maybe become less frustrated with them when they see that it's more of a biological issue, right? This is something that's impacted their brain functioning, and it's really hard for them to use the front part of their brain because it's not fully developed, and we have to help them do that. We also know that in typically developing children, they have lots of experiences in their environment that they internalize and then leads to their development of their sense of self. Well, children who have experienced trauma have had lots of, or maybe one or two, depending on the level of trauma that they've had, but they've experienced negative experiences in their environment, and they internalize those things, and they internalize their own reactions to those traumas as well as others. And that often results in a development of a negative sense of self. And our job here and our goal here is to try to help children develop 4 aspects of their self and identity. And this is what the developers focused on as being important in terms of developing a sense of competency. So one is a unique sense of self, a positive sense of self, a coherent sense of self, and then a future sense of self. And I think, I could probably go into detail for a long time about why those 4 aspects of identity are important for children to develop. But we know that trauma impacts all 4 of those. And then we try to work on integration of their sense of self and what has happened to them. So we really try to use the skills that we have been using throughout this entire process to help them identify the past and what has happened versus now in the moment, right? When they're experiencing a trigger, this is something that has happened in the past and is not happening to me now. It increases their ability to be more present in the now, in the moment, right? Using some mindfulness, and then understand and process their past. And oftentimes, in a lot of other evidence-based treatments for trauma, we talk about a trauma narrative, whether that's the child creates a trauma narrative or we help them develop that. ARC has lots of different skills and ideas that you can use depending on the child's age in order to help them develop a trauma narrative. And they find that it's very important for their parent to be a part of this. So it's really important for a parent to be able to acknowledge the trauma that their child has experienced in order to help their child develop and integrate a trauma narrative that is appropriate for their developmental level. So really quickly, in close, why do we think ARC is so wonderful, and why do we think lots of organizations should use it? Veronica, feel free to chime in. But basically, things that we've talked about, they take into consideration the child's developmental level and how to use different skills based on that. There's lots of ways to apply these skills clinically. They don't leave you hanging. It's really lovely how many different types of ideas that they have. It's a framework, and there's lots of flexibility within this framework related to how you approach trauma treatment, but all of that is within a trauma framework. They make it really clear that we're treating trauma. These are the symptoms of trauma. Psychoeducation is important. And these are the ways that you can address it within this framework. And like I said, it's flexible and nonlinear. Sometimes kids need to move back, right, to work on some of those modulation skills before they can go moving into a trauma narrative. We might think that they're beyond that they have done really well. They're using their coping skills, and then we try to work on the trauma narrative, and they're not quite ready. We move back to modulation again. Veronica, is there anything else you want to add about why ARC is wonderful?
I think that kind of covers it. I think I also just appreciate that a lot of it, I feel like are things that a lot of caregivers do. And I feel like I use a lot of the components, even when I'm not treating trauma, because it's just good responsive caregiving in general. So.
Agreed. We always find that we're using ARC strategies with our families. The last slide is just on teleconsultation services. We're not currently engaging in these right now. We were in the past, and we're hoping that we will be in the future. So you can go onto the Children's Center website if you're ever interested to see if we start to engage in these services again. If you have any questions, please email us and let us know. Thanks, all.
Thank you guys very much for that amazing presentation. I'm going to open it up to any questions from our participants. So if you have any questions, you can put those in chat or just go ahead and unmute yourself and we will, or raise your hand and we'll call on you.
And Veronica and I can put our emails into the chat as well, if that would be helpful since I stopped screen sharing.
That would be great. Kurt, I'm not seeing any questions in chat. Do you?
One just popped. Let's see. When discussing children trauma, that includes emotional. Just a comment that came.
I couldn't quite hear the question.
Okay, there was one comment. There is a question. Debbie asked, can you describe what services for an infant or toddler would look like?
Yeah, and this is this specific to trauma or just, you know, maybe a caregiver is worried about delays in general? I'm just trying to clarify, sorry.
Gotta find unmute, sorry. I am just curious. I actually made a referral for a little guy that was on my caseload, and it looks like you guys are gonna pick him up, but he's only about a year old. And so I was just curious what services for a little one that early look like a little bit. I have a better understanding of what.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess I can speak specifically to the Children's Center. So we have several different interventions that are helpful for kiddos who are, you know, within the 0 to 3 range. ARC is one of them. But some other ones that we have are ABC, which is attachment and biobehavior catch-up. And that is it's technically in-home. We're doing it virtual in-home right now, but it's sessions, and we're working on really wonderful foundational parenting skills like nurturance, regulation, following the lead, things like that. So that's really great for kiddos who are right now. I think we have 0 to 4. We can do ABC with. We also have child parent psychotherapy, specific to trauma, and that's for kiddos ages 0 and up. And we do that for families who come in and they're presenting with maybe a significant trauma, and we kind of get the green light that it's appropriate to do that type of trauma treatment with them. So child parent psychotherapy is a really great one for them as well. Veronica, any other additions to that right now? I think those are the 3 main ones, right?
Yeah, I think those are the interventions. And if, you know, just thinking about tailoring ARC to the little ones, to infants and toddlers, we're still going to work within those domains. But I think for my own work with younger children, it's really about helping caregivers manage their affect and understand their own emotional responses, and helping them learn to read that baby's cues. What does that mean, and why is that there? So a lot of psychoeducation to help caregivers understand the potential impact of traumatic experiences, so that they alter their responses to their child and strengthen the attachment.
Okay. You called it attachment, biobehavior, what?
Attachment and biobehavioral catch-up.
Okay. The other question I have is, I have heard varying things about payment for the Children's Center. the little guy I referred happens to have Medicaid, but do you also take other insurances, like for families from Davis County? Can they still participate if they don't have Medicaid?
Yeah, so we take lots of different insurances. I think there's something tricky a little bit about Davis County, but we always try to work around any insurance related issues because we can do a sliding scale fee as well based on parents' income. And there's also, if they want to get into our therapeutic preschool, we offer scholarships as well.
Okay, all right. I'm very hopeful that, you know, they just got started, and I'm hoping that it's, you know, successful for them, because I just think it's a great program. So
Yeah, I'm excited that you referred them to us. Thank you so much for that. And I'm hoping we can help as well.
well, I'm starting to refer more kids, because I'm seeing some things that I think are atypical behaviors for kids as young as like the little one I referred, and then I referred one more. He's just got some, I don't know that he had any like neonatal exposure to anything. The other guy, little guy I referred, but he's got some really challenging behaviors and beyond the scope of what I'm comfortable dealing with. So,
Right.
see these people.
Yeah,
I do for you.
absolutely happy to help. And we also try to help, even provide other, try to find other resources for them. But
Good.
Please refer the little ones. Because of ABC, we're able to do, even without trauma, we're able to do a treatment for very young ones. Like I said, I think actually it's not zero. We started around maybe
6 months.
Right? So 6 months, 6 months. Thanks, Veronica.
Okay.
We have one other question in here. It says, when discussing childhood trauma, does that include emotional trauma they may have experienced?
Absolutely, that includes emotional trauma, and a lot of that for our young ones is relational. It's based on a relationship with a primary caregiver. So absolutely, we treat all types of trauma: medical trauma, emotional trauma, relational trauma, the whole gamut.
Great. Thank you so much for that. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to Samantha and Veronica on that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to start talking about our case presentation. So Becky, while I get that set up, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and start talking about it. Sorry, you guys are seeing my desktop. That's not what you want.
Thanks, Janelle. You guys have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
So, yeah, hi, my name's Becky. I am here. Justin asked me to come on and join with you guys for a little bit of a case presentation. So I'm actually a registered nurse. You can go ahead and click to that next one if you want to. It's just a little bit about me. I actually teach health professions at UB Tech here in Vernal, Utah. I've been a registered nurse and I work in women's health I've been here for about 15 years. So we have one department that takes, LD, nursery, NICU, and postpartum. So we're, I think, a level 3 nursery. We're not, we still like to ship out our sick and our tiny babies, but I get some experience with that. I did teach childbirth classes for a while. I have 9 kids, so 7 of them I gave birth to. And then this last summer, we adopted 2 kids through foster care. And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about. I've been a foster parent for about 3 years. We've had 7 or 8 kids come through our home. 3 of them came to our home as newborns from the hospital. One of them is one of the little girls we adopted. The other 2, all 3 of them had exposure in utero to drugs and alcohol. And so I've got to experience that neonatal, neonatal absentee syndrome. So anyway, just a little bit about me. So I kind of have a little bit of knowledge about some of these things, but I really had no idea until I became a foster parent, really the depth of trauma and mental issues with these kiddos and the effects of drug and alcohol use. That's just my family. I'm missing my oldest son in there, but the baby that is in that picture that my daughter's holding, she was one of the little ones that we adopted. I've had her since she was 3 days old. And then Spencer, the one we're going to talk about, is the little guy standing down there actually looking up at his sister. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. So this is our little Spencer. He just a little bit of history on him. So he was born to a teen mom. He was actually her second child and third pregnancy. I believe she was 18 by the time he was born. But really rough history. She, I think, got pregnant first at 15, had her first child at 16, and really had a lot of other issues as well. She was a heavy methamphetamine user from a young age, started smoking, I think, before the age of 10, and then started, moving on to heavier alcohol and drugs. What she admitted to was meth, heroin, and alcohol, but obviously I don't think there were very many things that she probably wouldn't have tried. So we don't know the whole history behind her. When I met her, she was, young 20-year-old, had basically just some black stubs for teeth, was super thin, had sores all over her, kind of the typical meth user. Had, when we were able to read some of her history, she had sexual abuse histories. Both Spencer's mom and dad were both drug users and had been sexually abused at young ages. His mom also had borderline personality disorder. So anyway, lots of stress, lots of things going on in utero. His mom was in foster care when his older sister was born. And then in foster care, and then she aged out before Spencer was born. He lived with his mom off and on. His grandma told us that after he was born, he kind of bounced around from house to house. And some of the history of his mom said that she would use every hour, and they would calculate how much they could use without ODing. But super heavy drug user. So he kind of bounced around from house to house, spent a lot of time with his great grandmother. Lots of neglect, really unstable environments, not a lot of ability to bond with others. Just a pretty high stress environment. When he was about 8 months old, his father was on house arrest. His parents were together and had the kids with them, decided to get high, and dad cut off his ankle bracelet. So the police rushed in, took the kids, took both mom and dad to jail. So a pretty traumatic experience. So Spencer has an older sister that's 1.5 years older than him that we also had in our home. These two kiddos were removed when he was 8 months old. She was 1.5 years, somewhere around there. They were removed, placed in foster care for about 3 or 4 months. Their families couldn't handle their behaviors. They were pretty rough and really challenging. And so then they split them up into 2 separate homes. And they were in those homes for about 5 or 6 months, realized that mom wasn't going to get better, and those families were not willing to adopt them. And then they actually turned around and placed them back both in my home. Excuse me. So we had Spencer and his older sister. By the time he was 18 months old, is when we got him. He had a lot of delays, didn't sit, or I'm scared, didn't even roll until he was about 9 months old. Didn't crawl until he was, I think, 13 or 14 months old, and then didn't attempt to walk until he was about 17 months old. So started some early intervention with him when he was young, and kind of went through that. But but lots of delays. So go ahead and you can skip to the next one. Excuse me. So kind of a little bit of history. When we had him and his older sister, they did really well. We were planning on adopting both of them for a while, and things just got harder and harder and harder. His older sister had a lot of really, really challenging behaviors. And I did a lot of research, tried to get the help we needed. Unfortunately, we live out in rural Utah, and there's just not a lot of mental health services out here that were available. And DCFS kept telling me, they're too young, they're too young, they're too young, which was so frustrating to me because I kept saying, no, early intervention, right, guys? This is what what's so important. But I really had to push TCFS to kind of get any help. We took his sister to a counselor in town. And she did help her with her emotional regulation, just kind of helped her to understand what kind of emotion she was feeling, things like that. But she was still exhibiting a lot of really rough problems. I was quite certain that she had reactive attachment disorders. So I pushed and pushed and pushed for an evaluation, and it never happened. And then finally, I finally just said, I was ready to throw my hands in the air, and they said, okay, well, fine, we'll get the evaluation. And she was diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder and ADHD and several other things. Anyway, we were trying to move forward, trying to get the help that we needed, but couldn't find, we had really no services. So just some, her doctor had recommended, or the psychologist had recommended attachment therapy. We couldn't find that. That wasn't available here. Just counselor, which the counselor basically said she's a sweet little girl and she doesn't need therapy. And that was kind of the kickback that I was getting. And so we took her to, she was going to Head Start preschool, and she was just a little angel for them. And so again, I was getting this, oh, nope, she's fine. Everything is fine. I don't know what you're talking about. We ended up finally getting these diagnoses, and they still kind of went, well, doesn't really change anything. And then COVID hit, school closed down, and we had her home full time, and things just went from bad to worse in our home. And so we eventually, after 7 or 8 months of just really struggling and saying, we need help, we need help, we need help, we finally had to tell DCFS we couldn't keep her anymore, and which was a heartbreaking decision for us. But the trauma that she was causing to my other children, she was mean and manipulative, and she would steal things, and she would hide things, and she would poop in her closet, and she would pee on her floor just to make me angry. Just the things that she would do were just so hard. And anything that she could do to manipulate my husband and I, she was really good at. And so we ended up having to kind of change things up, and she ended up going to a home, to another home, and they were only able to keep her for about 3 weeks. I had asked them to send her out to the Wasatch Front where she could get some help, and they said they couldn't do that because they hadn't exhausted their resources. So they sent her to another foster family, and they kept her for about 3 weeks and couldn't do it. And then she did finally get to go to a home where she was the only child, and she has done a little bit better there. But unfortunately, their family has moved to Pennsylvania and kind of cut off contact with us. So we don't really know how she's doing at this point. Anyway, after all of that experience and all of that, I finally said, okay, DCFS, please, can I get some help with their little brother? Because he was just angry and upset and delayed and kind of having all of these same struggles. And so they finally agreed to let me get him tested. And so this is his list of diagnoses, which are pretty extensive. And it's interesting to me to see kind of where, where we talked about how autism sometimes can be misdiagnosed. And I sometimes wonder if that's the case here because of his other issues. But definitely definitely had some struggles. So anyway, he is autistic. He was diagnosed with autism type 2 with intellectual impairment. So today's actually his birthday. He turns 4. He still doesn't know his colors. He still doesn't know his numbers. Well, any numbers. He doesn't recognize his name. He's still really struggling with those things. He is in Head Start, but still we're just really struggling. He's not potty trained. He's completely resistant to that. But you know, he's some things he's doing better. He is ADHD. Thank goodness we found some medication that's helping with that. The one struggle, you know, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, dysmorphic, he actually has several facial presentations, which was interesting to me that my pediatrician didn't pick up on any of those things, but the child psychologist picked up on those pretty quickly. And so anyway, I know we don't have lots of time, so we'll go through some of this. Lots of trauma. I appreciated that presentation because obviously he's got a huge trauma history with neglect and other things. And then sensory issues are really a struggle for him. Heat, cold, bright lights, loud noises. He jumps off my couches. In some ways, he's a sensory seeker. He jumps and jumps and jumps and pounds and needs that stimulation to help him regulate himself. And then they ruled out reactive attachment disorder because he has the autism diagnosis, but he definitely exhibits a lot of those issues with reactive attachment disorder. Okay, go ahead and skip to the next one. So these were some of the recommendations that was given to us from our, we took him and had him evaluated by Touchstone Therapy. And these were some of the recommendations that they recommended. So to improve his skills to be successful in home and in the classroom. So they recommended applied behavior analysis therapy, ABA therapy, because he's autistic. Which of course is not available in the Uinta Basin, although there is a kind of a startup business that, you know, they're trying to get that going. I actually did find a company that does travel out here. So I do have ABA therapy going on right now in my home for it's about 3 hours a day, and they come, and I am seeing some help with that. So that's been good. They recommended occupational therapy. Originally when I took these diagnoses, so he goes to Head Start. We also have Central Co, which is our early childhood, you know, special education preschool through the school district. When I showed them his diagnoses and these recommendations, they had recommended occupational therapy and speech therapy, which really is not available out here other than just, you know, through them. And they basically said, no, he's not autistic. No, he doesn't have an oppositional defiant disorder. No, and basically discredited most of the evaluation and then said it's not really going to change what we do around here. And I said, why? And they said, well, we'll have the occupational therapist, you know, take a look at him, but he's really kind of still too young for this. And I was like, he's 3. And don't you guys, isn't this what you do? And they're like, yeah, we'll wait till he's about 3.5, maybe a little longer. And so kind of just pushed back everywhere we went. Speech therapy, we weren't doing, other than when he was younger. Justin actually did speech therapy with him, and that actually improved quite a bit. The recommendation though was that he needed to have more specific speech therapy because when he became dysregulated, he didn't understand or he would regress, his speech would regress back into older communication. So anyway, they want to focus on self-regulation, emotional regulation, communication skills, social interactions, cognitive and sensory integration. And so, and then obviously my husband and I needed some help with this. It's been all of this process. I have been like, I need help. I need people to teach me. I need to understand this. Most of what I've learned, I've had to learn on my own because there wasn't a lot of help available. And so DCFS did give us some training, but unfortunately, it's rural Utah and there's not a lot available here. So those are what my barriers are. Services aren't always available. We got pushback from DCFS or the school district not wanting to provide testing or services or those types of things. I've talked to several other foster parents that, you know, feel like their kids are struggling with these similar issues, but don't know where to go or don't know who to turn to. And I, you know, I keep reminding them they just have to be the advocate and they just have to push for them, because sometimes they're going to be resistant until they, you know, they just have to fight and keep fighting until they can get these services. So extensive time commitments, lots of stress. He actually applies, or he actually is like, his prescription for ABA therapy, he can actually have up to like 30 hours a week, but I don't have that kind of time in my day to be home with him, because I can't leave. I have to be there the whole time that they're there, because I have to have an adult there, which is really tough. And he's going to preschool and I also have a job. And so we only end up doing about maybe about 15 hours a week is kind of what we end up with. But my challenge is I could keep him home, but then I have to pay for a babysitter to be there so that I can have the ABA therapist there. And, you know, and that it gets pretty expensive. So anyway, those are kind of, oh, sorry, I have this high-tech classroom that turns the lights off for me. So anyway, it's expensive. And then, you know, children, the other thing that's really a challenge is he acts very different in class than he does at school. And so the teachers or the behaviorists in school don't see a lot of the reactions because he feels safe at home where he can be himself. He doesn't feel safe at school. And so he's very withdrawn at school, and they don't see some of the things that are going on. So I apologize, I'm taking up too much time. That's pretty much, go ahead and skip to the next one. And then just some discussion, how can more resources be available in rural Utah for these kids and their families, especially with foster or adoptive families. Just the education, I think, is huge. It would be, you know, so vital to these families. And I know so many foster parents that just, they were like, we don't know how to get help. You know, we're struggling with these things, but we don't know how to get any help. Spencer just recently, he got angry because he gets angry when he doesn't get what he wants. He got angry and he threw one of his toys at our big screen TV and shattered it. This is the second TV we've been through in the last 6 months. And I'm like, we're no TVs in our house. We're just, because he knows now that he can break them. Anyway, resources would definitely be helpful. And then many kids go undiagnosed. Again, I know, you know, how can they make testing more readily available for these kids? And then how can early intervention be a priority, where I feel like in a rural community, that's kind of a challenge. And that parents just don't know where to go for resources. So, and then also I've seen a lot of, you know, these FASD kids struggle with not having the resources because Spencer's autistic. He qualifies for special things, but FASD doesn't qualify him for any kind of special services. And so anyway, those were some of the questions. So that's it for my presentation. I think, was there one more slide?
Let me see.
I don't remember. Sorry. Yeah, that's just him. I just put, it's not his fault. He didn't ask for this and he deserves all the help that he can get. So that's a picture of him. So that's it. That's my story.
Okay. Well, we're going to take the last 5 minutes to try to give some suggestions and strategies for you. So if we can just have a group discussion about that, I'm going to leave up her community discussion that she would like some information on, and feel free everyone to just unmute and ask other questions or share information that you have for the next 5 minutes. I'm also going to put up our last poll if you guys take a minute to fill those out. So
will Utah Family Voices send a representative out to help with like IEP meetings and pushing for services in the school district? Does anybody know? I'll look into that, Becky, and I'll get back to you.
Okay, awesome.
Does UDAC comes down there, right? Dr. Winters comes down to Vernal every so often. Have you done anything with her or the UDAC program? She
So
comes from the University of Utah Children with Special Health Care Needs.
Yes, so that was happening before COVID, and I don't know that that's happening now. I haven't had any contact with. They go through the health department here in town, Tri-County Health. We originally filled out assessments, and we were going to go that route with them, but it was basically put on hold with COVID. Nobody was traveling out here to the basin, and so we kind of gave up on that. I submitted initial assessments for them and never heard back.
Anybody else have any comments or questions? Tiffany, okay.
I was just going to say, I feel your pain. We live down in Emery County. Fortunately, we have a great support through early intervention. They've just been awesome, but I've ended up having to take my kids up to Salt Lake every week for occupational therapy. And so we have early intervention coming, the health department comes every week, then this occupational therapy, and it is exhausting. And I agree that there needs to be more support for parents. Even if it's just figuring out how to take an hour break so you can shower or whatever it is. So I get it. And I just wanted you to know that
Thank you.
There are ways. You just have to, like you said, you have to fight for them. You have to keep pushing and fighting and fighting.
Right. And I didn't mention that his baby brother or his baby sister, we also adopted. She will be 2 in January, but she has also experienced a lot of these symptoms. She didn't start walking until she was almost 19 months old. And so we've gone through the process of, and thankfully we have great early intervention out here as well. It's when they hit 3 that I felt like I got dropped off and struggled so much. And we still did, the early intervention, or we did the early intervention preschool, but the services kind of lacked at that point. And we have had a referral because we had to take her out to University of Utah for they actually did an MRI and a CT scan on her because they were concerned about her great big head. And they ended up referring us to occupational health and speech out in Orem, but that's a 2.5-3 hour drive for me. So they wanted me to come out there 2 and 3, 2 days a week for both kids. And I just I can't do that. Yeah, that's too much. So it is
one of the things that I found with the school system, the school systems are hard, but I actually just take all of their testing and all of their evaluations and everything right before school starts. And I meet with the teachers and I meet with the principal all in one meeting. And I'm like, this is what you need to know about my kid. And he will need these services. I just kind of lay it out there, and that's been helpful, but there's not a lot of representation there for schools except parents.
Right. That's a good idea.
And then Jennifer Goldman-Luthi, Dr. Luthi put some great suggestions in the chat. So she just says that we need some practice change. If we have that, we're more likely to refer infants and toddlers for that ARC process, as well as some information in the medical home portal website that has some information about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. And then Debbie shares, I'm wondering if now that we've moved to a more virtual world, could you access more help like through the Children's Center or...
Yeah, I actually looked into the Children's Center, and when I had called them, because I had heard great things about them, and when I called, they weren't doing virtual at the time. So I'm hoping that those services will become more available. That would be awesome.
Well, we will certainly jot these down and share those with you, and see if we can find out other resources for you. Thank you, everybody, for your time. For today, we are at 1:30. Our next session is November 10th, and we will be learning more about speech and language within children exposed to NOWS. So thank you and have a great rest of your day.